the painting is the perfect example of romanticism because it conveys pure agony and dread. And paintings like this was considered too personal, which is honestly creepy. And another fact that makes it more horrifying is the fact that Henry Fuseli painted this on the walls of his dining room. He was eating while looking at this. Hello and welcome to another episode of Inclusivity Unlocked 3 podcast. Today's episode is gonna be a little different. We are gonna dive deep into romance and horror and how both are very connected. Yes, it's gonna mess up our idea of the word romance, and probably by the end of the episode when you hear the word romance or romantic, instead of thinking of pastel colors and intimacy, you will think of paintings of fathers eating their sons. But that is the point. We are here to learn how one word can mean something in the past into a total different thing in the present. So let's get into it. First of all, what is romance? The origin of the word romance derives from the Latin adverb romanis, meaning to write or to speak in the Roman vernacular. This referred to the everyday spoken Latin of the common people in the Roman province. This term was introduced in the early 12th century, which eventually evolved into the modern languages like French, Spanish, and Italian. So we are already far from the meaning of the word romance today. But here's where it gets interesting. By the late 12th century, romance shifted from describing the language to describing stories written in that vernacular language. And because these medieval tales heavily featured heroic knights and their adventures, the word romance started to be associated with courtship and imaginative heroes. Now, Boz, did you notice how literature was the reason for that change? Yeah, just keep that in mind. Now, following the history timeline to when the Middle Ages took part, and where major political and social changes due to the church control over Europe and their restrictions that stripped humanity of its flaws and feelings, romance concept was dim and sorta came back to its original meaning, which is also symbolic if you think about it. And then people had enough. And there it is. The Romanticism movement came to rebel in the 18th century. Now, yes, the reason why it was called Romanticism is because it was heavily inspired by the themes and imagination found in the medieval tales of chivalry and adventure that was also known to people as romances, with the desire to return to nature and the genuine human emotions free from the rationality and logic. Even though when you look up, is there a difference between romance and romanticism, it would show you that yes, there is a difference, but historically they are not. And to best summarize the reason for that movement is to quote the philosopher Rousseau's, "Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains." This was written in 1762, by the way. But anyways, moving on, this quote just shows what the people felt when they needed romanticism. So let's imagine this. We have romance that was logical in the 12th century, to it shifting slowly to be more imaginative and filled with stories, to it declining so strongly in the Dark Ages and became all chained up, and as a reaction it pushed back stronger than ever in the Romanticism movement. And I found this amazing quote in one of my favorite books, Gardner's Art Throughout the Ages. It says, "The romantic imagination stretched its perception of the Middle Ages into all the worlds of fantasy open to it, including the ghoulish, the infernal, the terrible, the nightmarish, the grotesque, the sadistic, and all the imagery that comes from the chamber of horrors when reason sleeps." Go back 10 seconds and hear it again, because yes, this quote is heavy and honestly insane, but that is exactly what Romanticism portrays. It shows what happens when you keep people's emotion locked up and chained. It will eventually explode and become something horrifying. And that's why one of the first Romanticism movement paintings look like this. This is one of the earliest paintings of Romanticism movement. It is painted by Francisco Goya from 1918, titled The Sleep of Reason Produced Monsters. The title itself is a story and honestly incredibly capturing. Goya portrays himself asleep while threatening creatures surround him, revealing his commitment to the romantic spirit and the unleashing of imaginations and emotions and nightmares. Now, when I first looked at this painting, I thought I could definitely pick another one to portray Romanticism better, but the more I observe it and read about it, the more spectacular it gets. The way you could see Goya burying his face into his papers and quills, sleeping and protecting his face, yet surrendering to the spirit of romance, which he portrayed as scary-looking creatures that do look familiar, yet distorted, with his lower body showing no signs of resistance because, of course, he is asleep and unbothered. And so the early terms of Romanticism was full of irrationality and expression that evokes awe and horror and supernatural events popularized by artists like Edmund Burke, and again Francisco Goya and Henry Fuseli. And another Henry Fuseli's painting that is also worth mentioning is Saturn Devouring His Son. The painting is the perfect example of Romanticism because it conveys pure agony and dread. And paintings like this was considered too personal, which is honestly creepy. And another fact that makes it more horrifying is the fact that Henry Fuseli painted this on the walls of his dining room. He was eating while looking at this. Anyways, this is not it. Romanticism also included themes of freedom and slavery, which are sensitive topics. Paintings like The Raft of Medusa by Theodore Géricault, capturing death and hunger. And in a quote from Gardner's Art Throughout the Ages, it says, "In this gigantic history painting, Géricault rejected new classical composition principle and, in the romantic spirit, presented a jumble of writhing bodies in every attitude of suffering, despair, and death." There is a lot of horror and chaos and emotions in this painting. And of course, it was provocative given the fact that it was also a response to new classical movement. Romanticism also followed themes of nature in a very unique way. A famous example would be paintings like Wander Over the Sea of Mist by Caspar David, that doesn't just show a man looking at a landscape, but a man looking at a purpose, at a future, at a secret waiting to unfold. Also, another painting worth of mentioning, and personally one of my favorite paintings of all, is Joseph Turner, The Slave Ship, painted in 1840. In Gardner's Art Throughout the Ages again, it mentions under the painting that the essence of Turner's innovative style is the emotive power of color. He released color from any defining outlines to express both the forces of nature and the painter's emotional response to them. He released color from any defining outlines. That's what makes it one of the best paintings to ever exist. The way he turned colors into fire, the way fire doesn't have defining lines, the way he matched the tragedy with the landscape to reflect its barbaric nature, slave ship moving far away, leaving turbulent sea with bodies of slaves which we can hardly see. We can only see hands sinking to death. And everything in this painting feels like it's moving. with again the composition of colors and brushstrokes evoking all the horror and fear. This is Romanticism, and Turner had a huge effect on later work from that movement. I mean, come on, how can you not be inspired by something like this? And now we are moving on to Romanticism and Gothic movement. And as we can see, Romanticism movement is very broad in concepts, unlike some other artistic movements where it focuses on one principle or one concept. But again, this is due to repression that artists suffered, so they took all the opportunity to let it all out at once. But all Romanticism needed was time to become stabilized. And that is where the change took place. When philosophy and science developed and humans started to understand human emotions better and started to break down these broad and familiar feelings into something relatable. And here we start slightly to enter modern idea of Romanticism, the one we identify today, which is love, intimacy, and relationships. However, the themes of darkness and supernatural events did not live in that era. Instead, they are beautifully intertwined, and that is due to the Gothic literature, which emerged way later than Gothic architectural movement. Gothic literature followed Romanticism in the 19th century and was often associated with dark themes, but not the darkness that comes with fear. It's the darkness that is familiar to humanity, which is a very interesting concept by itself, and especially when authors like Mary Shelley, who was a portal to Gothic literature, introduce a story about the horror of creating a monster, yet it's deeply intertwined with themes of humanity and love and connection. And yes, I am referring to the infamous novel Frankenstein that was published in 1818. And the way it affected literature and why it is considered Romanticism was due to the fact that the monster, even though historically monsters in literature were purely evil, Shelley gave her creature intelligence and deep longing for companionship. And right there, the brilliance of literature, the way it presents us with these philosophical concepts and studies in a way that it's relatable, in a way that made us understand the hidden depths of human psychology. Another reason why you should read fiction. Now, circling back to the timeline, after Romanticism and Gothic movement, and after artists and writers calmed down and realized they have taken it too far, we entered realism and naturalism movement in the late 18th and early 19th century, which introduced us with artists like Gustave Courbet with his famous paintings like The Desperate Man, which, unlike Romanticism, it showed ordinary human emotions as it is. And we are introduced to authors like Émile Zola and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who pivoted away from castles and ghosts and monsters and focused again on human struggles and grit, raw and without any other elements. So now let's go quickly over the timeline from the start. We started in the early 12th century when we were first introduced to the word romance, which referred to the writing and speaking in the Roman vernacular. Then by the late 12th century, the word romance shifted from describing a language to describing stories written in that language. Then in the medieval period, in the 13th century, that turned the meaning of romance being all stories written in that specific language to refer to heroic and imaginative stories. After that, we enter the Middle Ages and the darkest of times for artists. Romance as a concept was not the focus since there were restrictions of human emotions, so romance was dimmed down. To us going to the Romanticism era in the 18th century, freed from all the chains and flying way too high in the sky to the point where it become creepy, to us slowing down and starting to understand ourselves better, and for movement like Gothic interfere and helping guide these emotions but keeping the essence of imagination, to us removing all the imaginations and supernatural events and entering realism where we say what we feel, and that's it. And that's where romanticism and romance took a definite meaning. That's when it became the meaning of deep emotions and intimacy we form toward each other. That's when we started seeing it as love in pastel colors, because we needed to simplify it one way or another. But did you notice the pattern here in the timeline? How we either go far too high or far too low when we are trying to change a thought or a reason? How we either can be far too imaginative or far too realistic? How our way of rejecting an idea is to go as far as possible from it and do the exact opposite of its principles. Very interesting how, as humans, never could find comfort in balance. And what's more interesting is, when I reached the end of my research of the timeline of the concept of romanticism, I couldn't tell at which end we fall into. Are we too imaginative or are we too realistic? And for a second I thought, well, there it is, the balance. But what if that wasn't the balance? What if we are indeed at one of the ends and we couldn't tell because it's too familiar for us and because we are comfortable with it as it is, or that we are waiting for another perspective to change it to the other direction? Well, it's something to think about. And I hope I didn't ruin the word romance to you. And if I did, well, see you in the next episode.